Back in the early 2000s, I had just arrived in New York City, fresh off a plane from Somalia. Life hadn't been easy, but I was determined to start over. I landed a job as a janitor for one of the sleekest, most high-end office buildings in downtown Manhattan. The night shift wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills, and honestly, I liked the solitude. The city was loud and overwhelming during the day, but at night, in those empty offices, I could almost forget the chaos outside. Just me, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, and the soft glow of the city lights filtering in through the windows. The building was always eerily still at night. Sure, there were a few security guards, but they mostly stayed near the entrance, and every now and then, you'd see some executive burning the midnight oil. Mostly, though, it was just me and my cart, rolling through the empty hallways. I grew accustomed to the silence, finding comfort in it. One evening, I was told to clean the top floor of the executive suites. Now, the top floor was different from the rest of the building. The offices up there were reserved for the kind of people who didn't just work, they owned. They controlled, they wielded power. I didn't know much about the people who rented those offices, but I had heard whispers among the other janitors about one tenant in particular, Mr. K. No one seemed to know much about Mr. K. He was new to the building, having only moved in a few months ago. He always came and went at strange hours, and some of the other workers said they never saw him at all. But there was a vibe about him, something people didn't like to talk about openly. They said he was distant, kept to himself, didn't interact with anyone unless he had to. I brushed it off as just gossip. After all, plenty of rich people are eccentric. That night, when I stepped out of the elevator, the whole floor was in darkness, except for one dim light flickering from Mr. K's office at the far end of the hall. I don't know why, but something about it immediately put me on edge. Normally, the top floor was immaculate, like a museum display, perfectly untouched. But that light, it was almost like an invitation, or a warning. I hesitated, standing in the middle of the hallway, debating whether I should just leave it alone. But I had a job to do, and I didn't want to get in trouble for neglecting an office that clearly needed cleaning. So, with a deep breath, I walked toward the door. The closer I got, the more unsettled I became. The air felt heavy, thick with a strange tension I couldn't explain. I reached the door and knocked softly. No answer. I waited a moment, then knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. I knew I shouldn't go in. Something inside me told me to walk away, to leave it for another day. But the door creaked open slightly, like someone had left it ajar on purpose. My heart started pounding in my chest. I knew better than to go into a client's office uninvited, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, a sharp, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the usual musty, stale air of an office that had been left unattended for too long. This was different. It was pungent, thick, and unsettling. The room itself looked normal at first glance. Everything was in its place, the desk neatly organized, the chair pushed in. But then I noticed the faint flicker of the desk lamp. It cast long, distorted shadows across the room, making the edges of the furniture seem to bend and twist unnaturally. The air was cooler here, almost icy, despite the summer heat outside. Then my eyes fell on the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a shadow something cast by the flickering light. But as I stepped closer, I realized there was something there, half hidden in the darkness. A briefcase. It lay there, partly open, with papers spilling out of it like someone had gone through it in a hurry. My first instinct was to gather the papers, put everything back in order. After all, I was the janitor. It was my job to clean up messes, no matter how small. I knelt down and started picking up the papers when I noticed something strange. Beneath the scattered documents was a white envelope, half sticking out of the briefcase. It wasn't the envelope itself that caught my attention, it was the dark, wet stains smeared across the front of it. Blood. Fresh blood. I froze. My hand hovered over the envelope, trembling as my mind raced. What was this? Why was there blood in an empty office? I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the room was silent. Against my better judgment, I reached for the envelope, my fingers trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words were scrawled across it in neat, block letters: "You are next." I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. I dropped the envelope, and the paper fluttered to the floor, landing in a pool of shadow. The smell of blood was stronger now, so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the hallway, but the door was still ajar, and the footsteps seemed to echo from somewhere deeper in the building. I panicked. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to run. I didn't even bother picking up the scattered papers or closing the briefcase. I bolted for the door, my legs shaking so badly I nearly tripped over my own feet. The footsteps were still there, getting closer, and I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. I hit the stairwell running, skipping steps, nearly tumbling down the narrow concrete stairs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to get out of that building. I didn't stop until I burst through the lobby doors and into the cool night air. I stood on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. The building loomed above me, its dark windows like eyes staring down at me. I didn't go back inside. I quit the next morning, leaving a voicemail for my boss without explaining anything. I didn't want to explain. How could I? For weeks, I was plagued by nightmares. In every dream, I was back in that office, the bloodied envelope in my hands, the footsteps growing louder. Sometimes I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone was standing in my bedroom, watching me. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me to this day, is that I never found out what happened to Mr. K. The office remained empty after that night. No one ever saw him again, and sometimes, when I walk down a quiet street or find myself alone at night, I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, just behind me. I remember my days as a housekeeper at a luxurious inn in Charleston, South Carolina, back in the 1990s. My name is Mai, and I'm a refugee from Vietnam. I had left my past behind, arriving in a new country where I struggled with the language but worked harder than anyone. My colleagues admired my dedication, and I took immense pride in ensuring every room sparkled. Guests would often leave notes expressing their gratitude for my work, and I felt a sense of belonging, even if my English wasn't perfect. One particularly busy summer, a guest checked into the inn who would change everything. He called himself Mr. J and took the most luxurious suite on the top floor, with sweeping views of the harbor. It was a room only the wealthiest patrons could afford, and I was assigned to clean it. However, I soon discovered that Mr. J preferred his privacy. Each time I knocked on his door, he would kindly assure me that it wasn't necessary for me to enter. He was always pleasant and polite, but an unsettling aura surrounded him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. J remained a mystery. He stayed for over a month, and during that time, no one else entered the suite. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the door like a warning, and I never dared to push the issue. Then, one morning, I arrived at work to find the sign removed and the suite vacant. Mr. J had vanished without a trace. The front desk staff checked the records, but there was no sign of his departure. He hadn't checked out, and no one recalled seeing him leave. It was as if he had slipped through the cracks of reality, leaving no evidence of his existence. The inn manager was baffled. But since Mr. J had paid in advance with a credit card, no one raised an alarm. I was assigned to clean the suite once more. As I approached the door, unease crept over me. Something deep inside urged me to turn back, but professionalism prevailed, and I pushed the door open. The moment I stepped inside, a nauseating smell assaulted my senses, thick and rotten, like something had died. My stomach churned, and I covered my nose, my eyes watering as I surveyed the chaotic scene before me. The once opulent suite was now a disaster zone. Furniture was overturned, empty bottles scattered across the floor, and the bed was unmade, sheets tangled and stained. But the worst part was the smell, emanating from the closet, where the door stood ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I approached, every step heavy with dread. I hesitated, heart pounding, before pulling the door open. Inside, among the disheveled clothes, lay a cardboard box, oddly out of place. My hands trembled as I reached for it, a sense of foreboding settling in my gut. Lifting the lid, I gasped in horror and dropped it, stumbling back. The box contained a large clump of hair, matted and filthy, strands soaked in dried blood. The sight sent my mind spiraling. I had to escape. Heart racing, I bolted for the door, legs feeling like jelly. I made it to the elevator, hands shaking as I pressed the button. As the doors closed, I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, but the smell lingered, and the image of the bloodied hair seared into my memory. Before I reached the lobby, darkness consumed me. When I regained consciousness, I found myself surrounded by paramedics, inn staff, and police officers. The suite had transformed into a crime scene, with investigators swarming the area. They questioned me, but my mind was a jumble of panic and fear. The officers revealed that Mr. J had checked in under a fake identity, using a stolen credit card. The victim had been identified as a local woman who had been missing for weeks. The hair in that box was hers, a grisly piece of a darker puzzle. That day, I quit my job, unable to confront the horror I had uncovered. The experience left an indelible scar on my soul, haunting me relentlessly. I never returned to that inn. The terror of what I had seen haunted my dreams, and no amount of time could erase the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than I could ever comprehend. It was the summer of 2003 when I landed a job as a security guard at Ashford Manor, a grand estate turned hotel nestled in a remote New England town. The manor was impressive, with its towering stone walls and sprawling gardens, but it had a reputation that preceded it. Built in the late 1800s by the Ashford family, the estate had been home to generations of the family until the last of them died under mysterious circumstances in the 1940s. Since then, it had been converted into a luxury hotel, but rumors of strange occurrences lingered. Guests would often whisper about hearing voices in the empty halls or seeing figures out of the corner of their eye late at night. Some swore the old mirrors in the hallways held reflections of people who weren't there, while others claimed they'd felt cold spots or sudden gusts of wind in closed-off rooms. These stories made for great gossip over breakfast, but most visitors brushed them off, attributing the odd sensations to the manor's age. I didn't buy into the ghost stories. I'd always been the practical type, and as far as I was concerned, it was just another job. The building was old, yes, but old buildings made noises. Pipes creaked, wind whistled through cracks, and floorboards groaned under the weight of time. It wasn't supernatural, it was physics. Still, the first time I set foot in the manor, I couldn't deny there was something off. The air inside felt thick, almost heavy, and the silence had an unnerving quality to it, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Even in the middle of the day, the rooms seemed dim. My shift was the night shift, of course. I had been hired because the previous guard had quit unexpectedly, leaving without much of an explanation. The staff told me he'd just walked out one evening after his rounds and never came back. They said he'd seen something that spooked him, but no one knew what. That should have been my first red flag, but I figured he was just another guy who let the creepy atmosphere get to him. After all, it was a massive, mostly empty building in the middle of nowhere. Anyone could get freaked out walking its dark halls alone at night. My duties were simple: make rounds every few hours, check that all doors and windows were secure, and make sure no one was wandering where they shouldn't be. Most of the guests stayed on the first and second floors, while the third floor, the oldest part of the manor, was closed off for renovations. But it had been under renovation for years, and no one ever seemed to be working on it. The first few nights passed without incident. The manor was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional gust of wind against the windows or the creak of the old floorboards under my boots. I'd walk the halls, shining my flashlight into shadowy corners, feeling the cold draft that seemed to linger on the third floor no matter the season. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, I was making my rounds on the second floor when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from above me, from the third floor. I stopped in my tracks, listening closely. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was as if someone was knocking on a door, slow and deliberate. My heart rate picked up, but I shook it off. Probably just some loose window or an animal, I told myself. Still, I decided to check it out. I made my way to the old staircase that led up to the third floor. The steps creaked under my weight as I ascended, the air growing noticeably colder with each step. The hallways up here were darker, with no ambient light seeping in from the outside. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dusty floor and the old portraits that lined the walls. The tapping had stopped by the time I reached the top of the stairs, but there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was like a whisper, just on the edge of hearing, too low to make out the words. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I heard was the beating of my own heart. I started walking down the hall, my flashlight illuminating the cracked wallpaper and peeling paint. Most of the doors up here were locked, but I checked them anyway, jiggling the handles as I passed by. Everything seemed in order until I reached room 407. The door to room 407 was slightly ajar. I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. I knew for a fact that this door had been locked the last time I checked. The staff had made it clear that no one should be up here, and I was the only one with the keys. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe someone from maintenance had come up earlier and forgotten to lock it. But at 2 in the morning, that didn't make sense. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the thick curtains drawn tightly across the windows, but the beam of my flashlight revealed that everything was covered in dust. The bed was still shrouded in a sheet, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But something was off. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. As I scanned the room, my flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering out for a split second before coming back. In that brief moment of darkness, I saw something, a figure, standing by the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped the flashlight back toward the window, but there was nothing there. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light. But as I moved closer to the window, I saw it again, a flash of movement in the reflection of the glass. It was just for a moment, but it was enough. There was someone or something standing behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. Cold sweat dripped down the back of my neck, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking as I pulled the door shut. I locked it, my fingers fumbling with the key, and hurried down the hall, my flashlight now flickering erratically. As I descended the stairs, I could still hear the faint tapping, now echoing through the walls. It followed me all the way back to the lobby, where I finally collapsed into the chair behind the front desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't go back to the third floor for the rest of my shift. I didn't mention it to the hotel staff the next morning either. Something told me they already knew. The tapping, the whispers, The shadowy figure by the window, they became a regular occurrence after that night. Every time I made my rounds, I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. The third floor became off limits in my mind. I'd avoid it whenever possible, always making sure the doors were locked but never lingering too long. One night, about a month later, I found something strange. It was a journal lying on the floor outside room 407. The leather-bound cover was old, the pages yellowed and fragile. I picked it up, flipping through the pages, and saw that it belonged to Margaret Ashford, the daughter of the original owners. Her entries were dated from the late 1890s, and they told a chilling story. Margaret wrote about strange occurrences in the house, figures in the mirrors, voices calling to her at night, and the tapping. She wrote about how she often felt like she wasn't alone, even when no one was around. Her final entry was the most disturbing. She mentioned room 407 and how, in the middle of the night, she saw a man standing at the foot of her bed. He was pale, his eyes sunken, and his presence filled her with dread. The journal ended there. I never went back to room 407 after that. The manor continued to operate as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered in those old walls. I left the job a few months later, unable to bear the weight of the secrets the building held. To this day, I still dream about Ashford Manor. In my dreams, I hear the tapping, growing louder and louder, until it's all I can hear. And in the shadows of the hallways, I see the figure waiting, watching, and always just out of reach.